We're moving into the first panel session for the day, and this one is all about using data to help make world-class government services. We heard from our morning speakers how important data is going to be in improving government services. And the government, I think the previous government, I think it's rolled over to the new administration as well, has this pledge to make sure that at least 50 of the government's top 75 services will provide a great service against a number of kind of performance measures that have been agreed. So I'm going to have a conversation about kind of the improvement of public services and the role that data is playing in those. And we've got two fantastic speakers with us here to kick off the conversation. So we've got Ming Tang, who is the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at NHS England. And we've got Tariq Khan, who is the Chief Digital and Information Officer at the London Borough of Camden, recently come over from the private sector. So hello, and thank you to both of you for being here with us. Ming, I'm going to come to you first, and I'm going to ask, I mean, there are obviously huge challenges facing the NHS, NHS England, and it's definitely one of the missions, I think, of the new administration. Can you give us a sense of how data is already being used to kind of improve services, and what are some of the biggest challenges that you're finding in terms of that transformation?
Thank you, Swan. The NHS is large and complex. We're one of the biggest employers in the country. The way that it's set up is very distributed. So we have very distributed assets of hospitals, communities, diagnostic centres, labs, you name it, we've got it. So data is flooding in everywhere. Is that data usable to do a coherent story or to follow a citizen journey? It's very much over time, being collected by service. So it's really about service performance, activity, and outcomes of those services. So the big data challenge and the journey that we've been on over the last 5 years, and COVID really accelerated a lot of that, was really collecting data at point of use, moving away from fixed time collections to more event-driven data. So you heard Craig talk about events. So the ambition for the investment in data architecture is very much every time a citizen actually engages with the NHS, it kind of creates an event which then you can automatically join up as a journey. I think the really exciting thing and the way that we're using data now is really to support operational decision making, but also strategic planning. So I'll go through those two things quite quickly. Operational activities and planning. The journey from someone going into A&E, being admitted to a hospital ward to have a procedure, and then going home for rehabilitation is actually quite fragmented. You would engage with a number of departments. So making sure that data is at the fingertips of the clinicians so that they don't have to keep asking the person the same history again, making sure that we've taken the data from the electronic patient record for the clinician to be able to engage with that patient and make the best care, making sure that those data are available for the multidisciplinary teams that are engaging with the patient's families to help them get home if they're frail elderly, making sure that the social care package is available. All of those things we're bringing together into a data platform and products that allow those active workers to work together, bringing all that data to support decision making so that we can accelerate that journey. So the joining the dots that the PermSec talked about earlier on, Sarah talked about earlier on, was really important for us. And we're looking from moving to service orientation to life course as we move towards the prevention agenda, working with other people. The other part of it, more strategic planning, what we're trying to do by changing the way that we collect data, the way we use data, and the data foundations, is to really start thinking about what would a digital twin of the NHS look like? How would that support strategic planning? How will you then drive strategic scenarios on forecasting, if you change your configuration of the NHS, what would be the impact, what would be the outcomes, how would that actually, what's the cost impact of that, as well as patient outcomes. So lots
Really?
of quite distinct, but all built on data foundations.
Thanks. And I mean, that raises so many questions for me, what you said already about when you've got so many organisations involved and you're trying to link up all of those different data sets around one patient, kind of what are all the barriers that you might face? I'm going to see if the audience have questions in a minute, but there must be issues around kind of the legislation, around culture, around do people even understand what data they can share, all of those kind of issues.
Yeah, and all of those things are around the statutory functions. So there are some legal barriers that we need to kind of shift. There is quite complications around, I think Sarah alluded to it, opt-outs for individuals. So that allows you to say deny your access to the data for other uses than your direct care. So planning is another use apart from your direct care. So we have to be really careful. Health data is a special category. And trust with the public, trust with local organisations, trust between national, regional and local is really important. I'm sure Tarek's going to talk a bit about that as well, because some of it is misunderstanding, some of it is the legislation is quite clunky, but that you can find a way through it, and that's part of what we're trying to do, standardise the information governance frameworks, satisfy the kind of DPIAs that we're using so that we standardise and makes it a lot easier for us to have the same conversation, because the language is also quite difficult sometimes.
Thanks. So Tarek, before I go to the audience, so I want to ask you two things. So one, I do want to hear about what's going on in Camden and how you're kind of using data in Camden. But I know you have moved recently from the private sector.
Well,
and I just
couple of years ago, but
couple of years ago,
but
okay.
still.
But I just wondered, are there any lessons that the sectors could learn from each other about kind of better management of data and what's working well, what isn't working so well?
I think, so the first thing to kind of be aware of is, I think, when you look at private sector versus public sector, when I first came into local government, I was quite surprised by the level of complexity. We run 600 different lines of business. So we do everything from looking after the parks to adult social care to children's social care and looking after the roads. I realised recently we have a database of all the trees in the borough, which is very interesting. There's a large amount of complexity, and that breadth is not something that you would typically see in public sector. I've worked for cosmetics companies, newspaper companies, different, and it's normally a little bit more kind of specific. So it is a challenge. What I would say is sometimes looking in the public sector, you kind of look over the fence and look at the private sector as best in class. I've worked with organisations such as Unilever and Diageo, who are these big organisations who were born in the pre-internet era, and they are going through just the same challenges as we are. It's actually the organisations that have been born in the digital era, like when I was working with ASOS, for example, who have some of these, less of these legacy issues, as it were. Probably the biggest thing I've noticed in the jump between private sector to public sector is the focus around building public trust. When you work in private sector, that is a consideration, but it's not as much. However, Camden, for example, is a very ambitious council, and we have lots of aspirations to do lots of things with AI and lots of things with data. Typically you go into an organisation, you look at the data foundations, there's always issues around data quality, there's always issues around data governance, but actually this whole thing around public trust is something quite new and quite prickly. We're in an environment where a negative news story goes round 9 times faster than a positive news story. We're in an environment where we're talking about AI, but we're also talking about the digital divide, where some people don't have access to machines or know how to use computers, and they're feeling isolated because of that. So there's a whole new set of challenges there, which I would say are actually challenges, but there's also opportunities buried within that. So when you say, what can we learn from private sector to public sector, I would say that it's more than anything, I think, it's around understanding what the North Star is. in private sector, you have an amazing metric that cuts through everything, which is you either make money or you don't, right? And that is the kind of binding thing that says revenue KPIs. When you look at key performance indicators here, it's a little bit murky. It's a bit more of a team sport. You're not competing against other people, and so I think that in terms of learnings from private sector, I would say there's a bit around having that clear North Star, those clear objectives to aim for. But I would say that the challenge and the opportunity is quite different.
Yeah.
And we in public sector, and we should be. There are so many more opportunities in public sector to genuinely move the needle on the way that society works than you do in private sector, and that's incredibly enriching as well.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't feel like one side's doing it better than the other, which
Yeah.
I don't think is actually true.
And in Camden, is there a kind of equivalent? So Ming was saying in the NHS it's all about kind of that customer experience and joining things up. Is there a similar kind of...
Yes,
is there an equivalent then at the local government level?
Very much so. So, as I was saying, 600 different lines of business, right? And we're a London local authority. Actually, when you look at a citizen, they don't really care which borough they're in. They don't really care which organisational department they're in. They just want to speak to someone and get their issue resolved. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing is very similar to what lots of organisations are doing, which is, having someone come into our organisation and only discuss their problem once, and anyone in the organisation being able to resolve that. What we focus on a lot is how we use data to build empathy within our frontline services, and that's a really important. So I think there's a point around having the data and building the services, but actually there's a really important point, which is actually some of the things that I did learn from the private sector, which is how do you interpret that data to convey empathy within the frontline services. Yeah. And actually, on reflection, that's probably where one of the bits where we can kind of transfer over.
Great, thanks. Right, I'm very conscious. I've said it's a conversation, and the audience have been sat very patiently. Does anyone have any questions already? Yes, gentleman there with his hand up there. If we have a microphone, we can get a microphone up to you. Thanks, Brett. Any other question ready? Next question, and we'll get the microphone over to you. But yes, thank you.
Hi, thanks for all of those talks. They're really interesting. I'm Andy Cotterill from Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And I was just wondering, you talk about needing trust in order to get data, and I'm thinking it might be that you need data from end users, or it might be from trade associations who may collect incredibly useful data that we don't have in government departments. So one thing is acknowledging we need to build the trust, but how do we do that? Because we need to get that data in order to provide the public benefits. So how?
Thanks. That's a big question. Yeah. So, Tarek and then Ming, how do you build trust in the public?
So that's absolutely one of the things that I faced coming into Camden. A lot of people talk about building out participatory and inclusive approaches, but what does that actually mean? Like, how are you actually doing that? And I think the role of local government is actually quite a useful one in that it's a bit more, it's nearer to the community. There's a certain level of engagement and trust. So we have something called the Camden Data Charter, where we have tried to address a lot of these challenges that we've talked about, digital divide. So we've taken along, and the answer to it is not a silver bullet. It's not a policy or a process or a tool. Actually, it's slow, patient work. So we've hired a cross-representative team, a panel of residents from our community. We've spent months and months going through with them certain data use cases. We've brought in Alan Turing Institute to explain certain basics of AI. We've spent a lot of time creating informational videos that are sent out across the ward around what does machine learning mean, what does some of the key principles that we're talking about. And one of the really good things that I think we didn't plan on doing this, but actually one of the great things is our residents and businesses have typically seen our frontline services, our customer services people, but actually in those engagements, it's with our data engineers, it's with our data architects, it's with people that wouldn't typically see those people. And I think even just building out those kind of bridges and being able to see the actual human beings that are trying to do this work. Final point I'd just say on trust is, trust works when you're honest about it, and when actually, if you've got a panel of people that are saying, we feel uncomfortable with this and we're not doing it, and you're incredibly excited about it, you have to be respectful of that and you have to course correct. It's not just about, education isn't just one way, it has to be a two-way street.
Thanks, Ming.
I think what Tarek's saying is really powerful. We've started doing a lot more public deliberatives. It takes time, and I think it's really easy as a national body to say, oh, I've done a public deliberative, it took us 3 years, and that's it. But the reality is it's an ongoing thing. So one of the things we're looking at is how do we learn from private sector in terms of marketing? It's a campaign. What's what we've kind of nominally noted as the humanising data campaign, which is actually trying to explain some of the things that we're trying to do. But I would endorse exactly what Tarek said. You go into those panels and public deliberatives with a bit of a knot in your stomach, because quite often people aren't going to like what you want to do, and you and your teams might have spent months trying to plan up, thinking what a fantastic ideas. You've got all your business cases all lined up and you're ready to go, but it may be that they think it's a terrible idea. Now you might say that's because they don't understand and discard it, but it's at your peril to do that. So building trust takes time. One of the things that we found, which might be a bit of an interesting thing, is when we did, we've been playing with AI on discharge summaries, so how to help junior doctors write the discharge letter so that people can go home faster. We've used AI, and we've done some comparison between the doctor written and the AI written, because you can program the AI to be more empathetic. And actually, then we tested that against 100 patients, and they all preferred, I think it was like 98% preferred the AI version. So there's a bit of learning for us, actually. Allowing those types of use cases to come forward may help people understand why it's beneficial. And it's actually not talking about the technology, not talking about the way that you do it, and actually explaining it in the way that their journey is going to be improved, or how their data can be helpfully used. We know in health there are a number of red lines. Us sharing data with DWP is not well received, right? Us sharing data with insurance companies is not going to be well received. Us sharing data with HMRC probably won't be well received. So in the cross-government work that we've got to do, we have to make a really strong case to the citizen of why their data should be used in that particular way.
Thanks. Any other questions on anything to do with yes, there are 2 questions down here. So we'll take the lady, if you keep your hand up there in the black. Yeah, thanks. And then the gentleman in front. Thanks.
Hi, you talked about NHS and about the diversification and complexity, because,
Sorry, I can't hear. If you could just, thanks.
Yeah, is it better now?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So you talked about NHS and, it's quite diversified. We have hospitals, labs, NHS. And there needs to be uniformity in the data. The data governance might be of crucial step. How NHS England are able to cater to the data governance and the regulatory and the compliance of that in order to harness some insights out of that.
Yeah, we have quite a distributed governance process. So NHS England has a regulator who's responsible for making sure that there are data standards. We've got a data dictionary in terms of what data is captured. I think as we move into the more world of AI, those standards are being challenged every day, and it's more about what you capture from those systems and how we embed that into the contracts with those providers, so that, we stop doing this massive data process capture and it's more automated through APIs, etc. So that's the data collection piece, and that comes in as a data standard. In terms of sharing data, if that's what you mean by the governance, sharing data, we have a data sharing framework, but each foundation trust is a legal entity in itself, and each integrated care board is a legal entity, so they have to go through their local governance. What we're trying to do as NHS England is to say, here's a standard framework that you can use, and this is how we think that framework should be applied, and we can then work with the national bodies to make sure that it's used that way. For the Federated Data Platform, we've written that, and we've given those templates to local organisations to make it simpler. I think simplicity and standardisation are two things that we're really aspiring for, but it takes time, it takes trust, and you can't railroad it because, as I said, they're independent organisations. You have to be respectful of their governance, but what we can do is make it more simple for them to do that and give them the assurance that we've actually gone through some of the thinking.
And Tarek, I imagine there are similar issues around needing common standards if you're sharing data across lots of different organisations.
Yeah, very much so. Funny actually, because our old chief data officer is now the chief data architect at NHS. So a lot of what some of the earlier talks were about was around focusing on the roads rather than the cars, like making sure that the architecture's right. And to your point as well. So we've been looking at a data, thanks to Beata, we've been looking at a data virtualization model, which means that we're kind of engineering at source, as it were, and pulling things through. So we're getting there. It's a long, arduous process, and as Craig mentioned, it's not just the technology. It's a cultural thing. It's people, process, and all of those things as well. But we're definitely getting there.
The cultural issues are probably bigger than the tech issues,
Much
aren't they?
bigger.
Because, my dad's having a lot of problems at the moment. We're using the health service quite a lot, and it's just the bits of the system don't speak to each other. But it's not necessarily the technology, it's that the system and the people within the system aren't talking to each other.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I've inherited quite a large organisation through NHS Digital, HEE, so the data and analytics crowd, they've all come in with their separate cultures. What we've been trying to do is create teams that look across all our activity that we're doing to support primary care, to support mental health services. And even those, they are big chunks, they're siloed. So if you then persuade that across the NHS, it's massive. I would say, and it's a public sector value really, everyone wants to turn up to do well for patients. So you almost need to galvanise this as the impact on the person and the impact that we can provide to make their lives easier. And that's culturally what we're kind of coalescing around.
I think there's one other thing that people don't really mention in terms of culture. There's a big ecosystem, particularly in public sector, of entrenched actors. There is a lot of people for who it's organisations for who it's actually valuable and profitable for things to stay the same. And in actual fact, and so there's a lot of legacy architecture, there's a lot of legacy technology, and there's a lot of people making a lot of money out of keeping incremental changes rather than big moves. And that's not just externally, but obviously internally with the people that you've got. So when we talk about culture, there's some very powerful forces that you have to kind of really navigate in order to make the change.
Yeah, and you almost need to replace it and then
Yeah.
swap over.
Yeah,
rather, if you try and some of it, if you try and grow out from where you are, you just get blocked everywhere you go.
We're getting down to the real realistic. I think
Yeah.
we've got two questions, I think, and then that will be all we have time for in this session. Oh, okay, I'm going to take three very quickly, and you can answer any of the questions. So we're going to try and remember all three questions. So here we go.
Hello, hi. This is Jack from Global Government Forum. I just wanted to ask Ming Tang more about the case studies that you did, the use cases of AI programmed to be more empathetic, and just ask you to elaborate on what you found and some of the variables in that made for a better experience by the patients. What was it about that programming that gave the customer a sense of being heard?
Yeah.
Thanks, Jack. So there's the use cases and a little bit more about how they were more empathetic. Then we've got questions there and the final one here.
Hi, it's May. I'm from Department of Science, Innovation, Technology. We heard earlier from Sarah and Craig about data being an incredible asset and the need for infrastructure. So how do we balance as a public sector organization, the desire to share data, to promote innovation, and perhaps the need to maybe bring some funding and income to fund the maintenance of the data and continuous development of data to ensure better data quality?
So how do we get the investment in the kind of data? Is that what you're saying? Investment. And then down here, yeah, lady in the green there, Brett, thanks.
So you mentioned the AI generating empathetic letters.
could you just hold the mic up so people can hear?
Sorry.
Thanks, that's it.
You mentioned like the AI generating those letters which showed more empathy than the physicians, and I'm really curious in how then that translates to the physicians delivering that empathetic service. Because
That's a really
if
good.
we're having AI driving that forward, how then the learning, because real human beings interacting with the end users, with the communities, we also need that to be the case. And then so I'm interested and curious in how that happens, and then how do you see that translating into either increased trust with physicians, with the interactions that communities are having with you.
Thanks. So really great question, because actually those two questions link together. So that if you didn't hear, the final question here was, if AI has made some of that service delivery more empathetic, so in terms of those letters, are physicians learning from that and improving the way they then deliver their services to their customers? So let's start with that, and then maybe Tarek, you can take up the getting the balance right between, are we investing enough in the data infrastructure?
So a caveat, we're early days, right? But to your point, why was it more empathetic? It is the language. So it's more simple language, explaining it without the technical terms. Actually slightly more linked. So in a doctor's letter, they would go from one thing to another because that's how their mind works in terms of departments almost, whereas a letter was more of a narrative. So it was easier to understand from the patient's perspective. And yeah, they were the two main things. They just found it easier to understand and, in a way, not talking down to the patients, explaining it in a way that they understood. That's a key thing. That is a really good point. I'm going to take that back around how are the clinicians learning. Because one of the things I've got an anxious thought about some of this stuff is medicine, in a way, is the rites of passage. You learn as you go along. If we take away some of the more simple tasks, what happens to the education and the training of those clinicians? So we do need to build that back in, and I'll take that back and think about it a bit more.
Thanks. And then, Tarek, I think the question is that balance between sharing the data that we have, but also investing in new infrastructure going forward.
I mean, I think that's the biggest problem, right? Because what you're getting is everyone's very excited about AI. Everyone's very excited about what the potential is of it, but less people, probably senior leaders, know, if you go back to that Craig slide of the rocket ship, that actually all of this is powered by you having good data, good governance, good data foundations, and investing in that. And in many cases, that is the less sexy version of what we're doing. And it's our job as leaders to kind of build those stories out and make sure that people do understand that actually what we're doing is making sure that. So one of the things Craig was talking about was interoperability. I personally think that the world of AI and Gen AI and all these things, it's moving very fast, and actually the applications that are being built and created are moving exponentially. So you look at OpenAI, they're releasing stuff on quite a regular basis at this point in time, and as that's happening, more kind of secondary products are being built and then being collapsed, built and being collapsed, built and being collapsed. So actually, what we kind of need to do is make sure that if we've got one of the things I say to my senior leadership is, senior leadership of the council, is if we're investing, if we're putting our money in the foundations at this point, that keeps us in a strong position, irrespective of where we're going with a lot of these applications around AI, and it's public money well spent in order to give us a really good launch pad when we do decide to really go for it.
Brilliant. I think it is a challenge. It's a real challenge understanding it's changing so fast. It's kind of how do you
I think
keep that?
It's not getting trapped in that sexiness of the new technology. It's actually about what problems are you trying to solve, what's the strategic question you're trying to solve, and how do those things apply. And it may be a mixture of old school, new school, right, in order to solve that problem. And I think that's more important to focus, because that's where the value is. Focus on the value rather than the sexy tech. That always goes well with investment.
And it goes back to that ecosystem of suppliers that you've got as well, right? There's a narrative of fear of missing out. If you're going, if you don't get on the board, you're going to be behind. You're going to be and there's a certain element. Of course, we want to use this technology, and it's really exciting. But equally, what you really want to be doing is investing in some of that foundational stuff. And in our case, it's just one London borough. There's 35 of them. Absolutely, like one of the key things that we want to do, to your point, is being able to share some of this information in a much more productive way across different councils and with national organisations as well. But that's not there yet without the consistent investment in data foundations.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Ming and to Tarek.
Thanks.